So, a warm welcome, everyone, to our eHealth Learning podcast, a space where we encourage the sharing of knowledge and the support that brings. Thank you all for joining us. At Embodied Health Learning, we are passionate about sharing, inspiring, educational, and accessible content with everyone. That's why our podcasts are free to listen to, because we believe uplifting knowledge should be available to all. If you find value in our work and want us to keep going, please consider making a donation. You can find the button on our podcast page on our website, www.ehealthlearning.tv. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue to offer these resources to the wider community. Many thanks to all those who've chosen to support us. If you're not aware, we have a very interesting and broad subject collection of topics in our back catalogue, so please do take a look. For this evening's podcast, I've invited Mark Vernon to talk with me about spiritual intelligence and what that might mean for us as individuals. Mark is a psychotherapist and an author with an interest in spirituality and inner life. If you have any questions for Mark as the conversation progresses, do put them in the chat box. We are happy for you to interject, but we'll also aim to leave about 10 minutes at the end to answer any questions that might come up around the topic. So thank you all for being with us today. I'm just wondering whether we might start, before I start talking to Mark, that we might just all come together in a minute's silence or so, just to sit and arrive. It's been quite a busy day. I don't know how it's been for everyone else, but I think it might be good to arrive into a listening space, if that feels okay with you all. Okay, so I'm just going to use my ding-a-ling here. And we'll just spend about a minute sitting together and arriving, okay? So, Mark, thank you for agreeing to this conversation today.
Hey, look, it's nice to join you. I'll look forward to how it goes for sure.
Yeah. So how are you and where are you? Where are you today?
I live in South London, and I'm coming from there, and I work partly as a psychotherapist as well as writing, and yeah, I'm actually quite glad. At the beginning of the day, I thought maybe I had some sort of bug coming, but it hasn't developed. So I'm feeling a bit relieved in that very particular respect as well.
Yeah, bless you. It's that time of year, and you might hear I'm slightly coldy today, so I'm going to be using my mute button discreetly to try and cover any coughing. I feel well, but I'm definitely still. It's just that time, isn't it? It seems to be a lot of it
Uh-huh.
about. So before we start on the topic, I wonder if you might share with us, Mark, a little bit about your practice and how you got to where you are today.
Actually, maybe just to say one thing about Zoom and coughing, it screens things out, and it actually screened out the sounding bowl. At least I didn't
Ah,
hear it, so I wonder whether Zoom sudden sounds freak it out and it screens them out, like coughing, which is helpful, but also like gongs too, which isn't so helpful. And it's just for future reference.
oh, bless you. That's really good to know. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, yeah. So I work about half my time as a psychotherapist, and that's in private practice. and then the other half writing and talking and so on, and in the ways that that shows up sometimes at festivals. I help organize a couple of things as well. And I partly got to that because I did a PhD on Plato, on ancient Greek philosophy. And there's a sort of backstory to that as well, which was having come out of the church. I was a clergyman in the church, and I left the church for one reason or another, which we could talk about, but ended up doing this PhD on Plato, trying to sort of find some worldview. And what emerged from studying this ancient Greek context was that who you are and where you are and how you are in the world matters quite as much as what you think you know. There's a kind of what in the philosophical world would be called a participative epistemology, which means that how you know is directly related to how you participate in the world around you. Whereas, nowadays the scientific gold standard would be quite the opposite. The objective stance would be the one that would be regarded as most revealing of the truth. And so when I had done this PhD, I thought, so where is this practice that is alive and active? Because I think wisdom traditions have to be alive and active to be useful, because they have to be able to respond to particular moments, not just be written down like some kind of system or manualized. And it occurred to me that psychotherapy might be such a tradition. And so I started my own therapy, and that was also about trying to catch up with myself a bit and work out what had gone wrong earlier, particularly in relation to the church. But to be part of a living tradition was very valuable. I mean, Carl Jung actually said that he thought psychotherapy emerged because the living traditions of interiority in Western Christianity, particularly, had died largely with the Reformation, partly certainly in the UK, with the closing of the monasteries in really quite short period of time, within a decade, just ripped out from the life of the country a huge part of the life of the country, actually. I remember once being told that in the medieval period, you were never more than half an hour away by foot to a religious house of some kind, be it women or men or mixed. And that just sort of suddenly went. And no doubt they were a bit of a mixed bag, and some were corrupt and all that. I don't want to idealize them, but I think it was a real trauma, actually. And immediately various sort of prophets and movements, and perhaps the Romantic movement was a big one, but that tried to recover interiority appear. But psychotherapy, again, it's got its faults. We could talk about that, but it is one that I think is trying to take that side of life seriously. So the combo of the writing, which is mostly about these inner traditions, say I've written about William Blake and about Dante, and about Christianity, and then also about spiritual intelligence, like you say. But the combo of that with actually a living practice that has its monastic resonances. Psychotherapy, you meet the same time in the same way each week, and that builds up a kind of pulse, which is not unlike the hours, as they were called in religious houses, of the office. And yeah, so that's kind of come together although in one way it can feel quite different, look quite different, it feels quite the same, actually, from within. Anyway, I burbled a bit and said perhaps quite a lot.
Yeah.
So
Well, you
let's follow
have,
some
and
threads.
I think it's really interesting that you know, you're talking about spiritual intelligence now, but there was obviously a spiritual life that you had before through the church. So I'm wondering how those, yeah, sort of, yeah, what went on for you in your kind of in your spiritual life within that, and then leaving, which sounds like it could be a wound, a little bit like how. I don't know, you describe the monastic kind of disappearing in the culture. You know, there feels like there might be a bit of a parallel there. And then you finding through psychotherapy, this spiritual intelligence. I'm guessing that's where it's come from. I'd like to ask you about that. But
Mm.
yeah, the fruition of spiritual intelligence. Yeah, if you could maybe, if that makes sense to you, yeah, talk about that. That'd be interesting.
I mean, maybe it's worth you saying something a little bit about what this phrase spiritual intelligence might be even pointing to. Um, and there's a lot that we might say, but a starter for 10 is I think there's broadly two ways in which it's used. And one way is seeing it in relation particularly to emotional intelligence. And with emotional intelligence, you know, you might define that as the capacity to relate to your feelings wisely, um, meaning that you're able to sustain relationships, or to kind of love yourself enough not to be constantly tripping up over yourself. And you know, there might be a kind of facility in the workplace which is different from the facility in the home, but you can operate emotionally in those different locations. And then there's other factors, you know, you when you feel down for some reason, it's not like your whole life is getting dragged down, because you recognize that emotions move up and down, and so you're able to um, uh, go with those ups and downs, and so on. So there's a whole area around emotional intelligence, and sometimes people think that spiritual intelligence is kind of like an extra facet of that, which is a recognition that there's a life or vitality um, around you as well, um, and that your soul, for example, you might say, can relate to a wider soul, maybe the soul in other people, maybe the soul in nature, and then you know, for those who are theistically inclined, to God as well. And so it's another kind of felt relationship. Um, and I think there's a huge amount in that. I think that is a big part of it. And you know, so meditation, for example, might be a practice that enables you to develop enough inner space that wider dynamic becomes more and more palpable and relatable to. That might be one way that meditation's used. And within mystical traditions, I think you can broadly put that in a box that's sometimes called the way of affirmation, which is seeing the life and vitality that is around you in all things. You know, so William Blake, for example, when he says to see a world in a grain of sand, that's a living connection at the essence of that which is even in a world of a grain of sand, and in you. And for Blake, that would be the divine presence that's in all things. But I think there's another way in which spiritual intelligence can be used, which, again, one label that might be applied to that would be the way of negation. And this seems like completely the opposite, but actually I think they end up in the same point, which is to put to one side all that might be within you as your own inner life. So thoughts and feelings, there's a practice there, but also putting to one side all the delight or fear that you might find in the world around you, be that other people or the natural world, and even putting to one side all that you feel you might receive from God, you know, the love or support, or, you know, if our God image is a very complex thing, so maybe the sort of fear or judgment, whatever it might be, you put all that to one side. And the tradition particularly I follow is based on a book called The Cloud of Unknowing. And the cloud of unknowing author would say all that goes into the cloud of forgetting for the purposes of the practice, so that you're sitting as much as it's possible. And of course it moves moment by moment, but at least in some moments you're sitting with nothing but a kind, as the author puts it, a naked love for the cloud of unknowing, which is unknown, ineffable would be another word, and yet is somehow known as the divine presence that exceeds you, and yet also is closer to you than any of these other things that have gone into the cloud of forgetting. So it's a kind of letting go practice that over time makes you more and more aware of the divine presence, which is both greater but also more intimate than everything else, and everything else sort of springs from that source in some way. And so when you do the practice, the cloud of unknowing practice, but that isn't the end point. Then of course you live your life too. And when this was practiced in the monastic settings, of course it was always practiced in a monastic way of life, with offices and with no doubt manual work that had to be done, and studying that perhaps was done, and cooking and whatever else. But the point is that all those other activities then are known in relation to the divine presence that you've become more alert to through this way of negation. So the way of negation actually and the way of affirmation are quite complementary at the end of the day. And I think that all that can be called the developing of spiritual intelligence. So it's that, as it were, which lies within or beneath or beyond what emotional intelligence might be about, which is a more practical, everyday, feelings-based approach to living wisely, living well. Spiritual intelligence would be, perhaps a word would be more of a kind of intuition about the very fabric or the basis, the ground of reality. And so within religious traditions of one sort or another, you get these practices that enable you to develop that spiritual intelligence. So that's a sort of bit of a definitional thing. But for myself, making it more personal again, I think I just didn't find that in the church, is the quick answer. It's a bit blunt, but not that blunt, actually. There's a lot of other things which I found in the church, and moreover, a lot of other good things, as well as things that I couldn't stomach very well. So a concern for social justice, for example, or a concern for community, or a concern for moments in life that can be helped by rites of passage, like weddings and funerals, and a concern for locality and place, a concern for old buildings, which is not to be sniffed at. I actually think there's a huge spirit and soul in old buildings, and for music and liturgy and pastoral care. So, lots of concern for that, but strangely not really spiritual intelligence. If you asked any priest in the Church of England, what meditation is, they might not really know. If you said prayer, they would think of petitionary prayer quite spontaneously, and there's a value in that. But it's not really the heart of the tradition, I don't think. And so I left for other reasons, but one way of charting my kind of quest is, so where can I find this spiritual intelligence? And the psychotherapy partly helped, but it wasn't really actually until I came across Buddhist groups who know how to hold silence that I started to realize it can be taught, actually. And then, but I realized I wasn't a Buddhist. I'm too much of a theist. But that was one of the ways that did lead me back to discovering more of how that is still just about present in the Christian tradition. And so that now feels like the main focus for my Christian practice, really. The truth is I don't really go to church. uh, I just don't really find um, what I'm really looking for there, and it gets confused and clouded out by all sorts of other things. Um, but a personal practice that's supported by, I mean, I do actually go to Buddhist silent sittings, because they just know how to hold silence, and that is an art in itself, actually. Um, yeah. So again, I feel like I'm beginning to ramble a bit, but and say quite a lot. But
Not
yeah.
at all, because what I'm sensing, is this, this insane curiosity that is kind of in you to find the thing that you're after, and isn't it interesting that we have all these institutions that are kind of set up for particular things, and actually we don't find that thing there at all. It's kind of like, oh, there's a kind of seems to be maybe in the last 20 years this real kind of individual search for the meaning and belonging and spiritual life. And quite often people say, I don't find it in church, but I go into a wood and I find it there, or I go to the sea and I find it there. So there's an intimate relationship. You haven't got a whole congregation with you, but you're having some kind of experience because you're kind of led there in a way. It's hard to sort of describe it in words, but there's something happening. And you mentioned the word soul, and I wonder whether that's the driver that you start to hear your soul speak. And it's something that isn't to do with your material life or your work life, or there's a maybe there must be something more than this, or there may be, who am, the big questions like who am I? And where do they take us? And quite often, it can be the breakdown or the ending of something that gives you the leap or the trajectory to kind of go out and seek something because it feels like it's got to be there somewhere. So I think that's a beautiful kind of wefting and weaving of trying to find that truth for yourself. And I think lots of people are on that journey actually and feeling quite isolated with it. And maybe something like your book helps to, just give it some compartmentalization. Recognizing, this is what it is. So if inner truth starts to arrive, it's kind of like, is that real? Am I, if I'm relating to nature in a particular way and it speaks to me, is that real? Because you look like the crazy, or, so for there to be some kind of, like you say, some ground is really important to that. I feel personally anyway. So finding your truth in that and feeling like, oh yeah, this is where I belong, or this is what I do. These are the repetitions that I do to keep myself well and engaging. And then maybe one could enter into a faith life, through that door. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's sometimes. I mean, you might call it a mystical path, but the risk with mystical things is they mystify, and I think it's every day. I mean, even now, we're gathered in our different places, connected through the technology, but also connected in a kind of shared field of attention. And everybody here, and you and I vocally, are kind of reaching into that field and bringing our best us words, but everybody a kind of quality of attention, listening, and what is then felt is a shared presence, that with just a sort of a subtle shift of your attending to it, rather than just listening to what one person's saying, then another person is saying, but attending to the field itself that we're sharing, the kind of silent presence that is holding our conversation, our communion, even. And for me, that's what spiritual intelligence knows and learns to trust and rest in that, because that is the soul, the divine presence, the spirit. Maybe these words have slightly different inflections and can be used in different ways to point out different facets. But learning to rest into or lean into or just recognize that presence, which is easier to do when you're sitting down and attending in the way that we are now. But I think also, like you're saying, people might walk into a wood, and perhaps because other noise or other things that cloud the vision in a more humanly constructed environment lessen, that brings to the fore other things that might be at first, the presence of particular creatures like the trees or other animals or the sky, the horizon, and so on. But then that too can give way to this more the presence within all the presences as well, and so becomes meditative, and gives rise to this sense of life itself, vitality itself. Yeah, so that I think that's really it's a very valuable thing to know about. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
and to experience, isn't it? It's like we use the word embodiment now. So this, as you describe the wood and all the other elements that might be surrounding us, it's like we are in relation to that then. So I am here, and here is a tree, and here is the bird, and I am, I exist, even that kind of the dawning of the realization that I'm not just this story of myself. I am actually real, and to me, that feels like a spiritual intelligence, and the difference between, an emotional intelligence for me means I'm at the mercy of my senses, which quite often has got me running down the road. Whereas actually, to be able to stand as a tree, or next to a tree and to feel like I exist in relation to that, yeah, gives me, um, yeah, like, yeah, it's a something. Wow, there's an awe. I'm slightly inspired, not, I'm looking now at I don't know, the sun and through the trees or whatever, and everything's kind of making this incredible vista. Or, my imagination or my that inner part, that depth of me that I didn't even know existed starts to kind of bubble up, I think. Something like that, yeah, where the imagination becomes active and I am in presence of myself and what's around me. Um, yeah, something
Mm.
like
So you reminded me, I have a friend who works with horses, so she works with equine therapy, and it's fascinating hearing her talk about what the horses bring. But one of the things maybe is related to what you're saying, which is that we have eyes on the front of our head, binocular vision, which is very, very useful in many, many ways. But it does shape our mode of attention to the world. It makes it more, we grasp things and we use that both physically and, of course, mentally. And it's got great advantages. Horses have eyes on the sides of their head, and so don't have that binocular vision, but have a more diffuse awareness. And we're sort of herd creatures. Well, we're social creatures. I don't know if we're quite herd creatures, but horses, do identify with the herd. My friend particularly tells me, and that's facilitated by this peripheral vision that is much less focused on the one creature in relation to the rest, but is shared more amongst the creatures. And this is one way of understanding why horses have such a powerful presence and can be so useful in equine therapy, because they're clearly intelligent creatures, but are relating to what's happening in a very different way. And so that can have this expansive effect and make you reflective and feel things in a different way. So yeah, that's perhaps just another way of riffing on what you're saying, and we experience it maybe as more embodied, because the more grasping, focused, binocular attention is associated with our heads, because that's sort of where we experience it. Whereas something that's more diffuse and more widely receptive, falls away from our head and into our body. Um, yeah.
Yeah, so this sort of, ability to be able to commune, because sometimes, I don't know, the material world can make us feel like we've got to make everything happen. But actually, if we can just stand still, everything's happening. There's something, isn't there, about kind of switching up our understanding. And so it kind of leads me into kind of wanting to ask you about the book. And, how did the book come around? Like, what was the beginning of? I mean, we've got the fruits of kind of what you've been drawing on, but yeah, to kind of, because it describes a sort of 7 steps. Is that correct? Yeah, so maybe just give us a little bit of a kind of background of the book and how it arrived.
It came out partly because I was involved in two research projects with a wonderful organization called the International Society for Science and Religion that works at the interface of science and religion. And one project was about human evolution and the role of spiritual intelligence in human evolution. And broadly, the idea there is that human evolution is normally told in very instrumental terms. So it's what was it, particularly about Homo sapiens and then the species that came before that facilitated their survival. So it might be bipedalism, it might be language that enabled social connections that were good for survival. Um, all sorts of things, might be discussed. It might even be that the imagining of gods was good for survival because it makes you feel that everything is alive, and so you need to respond to everything. And so when the tree does contain something that's dangerous to you and you leap out of the way, that's good, even if you thought that it was a spirit or a ghost in the tree. These kind of very instrumental descriptions are given. And I find them, no doubt there's something to them, but they feel thin, and actually often not very plausible. So just on that business about jumping at every movement of the tree, thinking it might be a spirit, and then every so often it's actually a tiger or something. When you actually think about it, someone who really did know the forest, if they were leaping around freaked out by every single rustle, they'd be completely useless. It's because they actually understand what's going on in the forest, that they are useful to have. So this led to this other way of thinking about human evolution, which is about our capacity to know more and more clearly about other people, other creatures, the world around us. And it might be through storytelling, it might be through ritual, it might be through beliefs as well, convictions about the way the natural world and the cosmos actually is. And so that can be called a kind of intelligence, because you can express it in other forms, maybe linguistically, maybe ritualistically, and you can deliberately investigate it, perhaps through festivals, through trance, through the things that broadly you can associate with religion. And so homo religiosus, you might say, is the distinctive feature about us. And no doubt practical benefits come from that, like social bonding. But the real driver is a kind of distinctive capacity to investigate inner worlds. And so, I mean, I like to think that there was just recently in the news, there was a thing about how Neanderthals would have developed the capacity to manipulate fire. And this was, pushed back a few 100,000 years, the ability of our ancestors to manipulate fire. And this is normally talked about in terms of safety. You know, if you can manipulate fire, you can scare off predators, or if you can manipulate fire, you can cook food, and so you get more calories from food and so on. But I like to think that perhaps the really amazing thing about a creature that can manipulate fire is that the light could be extended into the darkness. And the god that was the sun, suddenly you had a very, very different relationship to that. And you became a kind of custodian, perhaps, of that deity, or you could maybe manipulate that deity in some way, because you had this absolutely phenomenal ability to not just be subject to the setting of the god, the setting of the sun at the end of the day, but you could carry that presence in the form of light into the night. So that was absolutely revolutionary in terms of our spiritual development. And no doubt cooking was helpful too. And no doubt fending off other creatures was helpful as well. And then you get maybe these intermediary things that extending the light into the darkness brought, that with the spiritual presence of this light in the darkness, new stories became possible to imagine, and you received from the spirit of the light in the darkness in a different way. And so the imagination would have grown, and an awareness of different dimensions of the cosmos would have become more and more present. And so it would have led to different festivals and different rituals and different kinds of ecstasy and so on. So all this was a step in our spiritual development of spiritual intelligence. So the book is not so much practical steps, although I try and build that in a bit. It's more a kind of consciousness raising steps. What are the steps that led to this thing that we can call spiritual intelligence? And it's partly telling the story of ourselves as a species, and then there's other things as well. So this shifts our relationship, for example, to death. That would be another step, which spiritual intelligence would seem to have much to do with, which broadly speaking would be to see dying as not just something that happens at the end of mortal life, but can become part of everyday experience, because it's a kind of letting go into a wider life. We would talk about it as dying to self, perhaps, or in Christianity, it's these phrases that he who loses his life gains it, and so on. So the relationship to death is another step, and step change, you might say, that expands the notion of spiritual intelligence. So thinking about human evolution suggested some spiritual steps to spiritual intelligence. But then the other project that I was involved with was thinking particularly about what spiritual intelligence might be in relation to artificial intelligence. So the broad stance here is artificial intelligence is already changing things, no doubt will change things very dramatically for good and for ill. And there's partly work to be done in relation to that change, thinking about things ethically, perhaps. But is this also a moment for us to recover a quality of intelligence that perhaps has got a bit lost in the modern world? Not unrelatedly to the loss of religious traditions and the wisdom that would have been held there. By kind of contradistinction, if artificial intelligence is a certain kind of intelligence, and is it even right to call it intelligence, and so on, all these questions can be asked. But as a kind of reflection of that, what does that then tell us about our intelligence, and how qualities like intuition and qualities like presence and qualities like who we are and how we're becoming, the virtues would be a way of putting that, all these become steps to the recovery of a spiritual intelligence as well. So the book is a gathering into 7 chapters that emerged partly from me being involved in these 2 projects, and then more broadly my engagement with spiritual traditions as well.
Yeah, beautiful. Because I think that the word recovery, this reclaiming of something that's been lost, that's so innate in us. How can we find and plough the depths enough and give it structure and apply it to our ordinary lives, that it's with us when we're washing up and trying to do all our ordinary stuff, so that consciousness doesn't drift away, that we can be fully present in what it is we are doing, as well as relating to the cosmos or the higher self, or that there's some kind of meeting place for those two things to exist, so we are a one rather than a dichotomy. So I think what you touch on is really important and fruitful. It's like it anything that can help us bear our fruit, that can help us to kind of go, oh yeah, that's what's going on for me. Because it's hard to find it. There's so much information now. There's so much distraction. There's so much to be concerned about, that actually overwhelm can kind of lead to apathy in a way, can't it? Because it's just too much to bear. So to have ways that give us an ability to, yeah, put a handle on things at our pace, because I think sometimes pace is very important, isn't it? And how we are, letting go of things and then trying to bring in the new. That there's a compassion and a kindness, and that we can, have a healthy relationship with self in that, can give us the ground. I think, this ground that you talk about, and the book, I think, really talks about that as well.
Yeah, and I think that there is all that, and then another facet comes from the psychology world, and I know particularly the psychotherapeutic world a bit, but more broadly in psychology. So this might be clinical psychology, or and the way that psychology is studied. And I think worldview really matters. So psychology, in its various forms, arose deliberately agnostic about worldview, saying it doesn't matter what you believe, what matters is a method, and can your method reveal insights about, say, the human psyche, but the psychology of other animals, and as well, because that can be studied too. And this has been very beneficial. It's produced all sorts of even tips and hints and tricks, and you can read about in self-help books, and as well as traditions like psychotherapy. But I think that overwhelm you mentioned can be felt in the world of psychology too. What is the thing that I need to live a better life? What is the practice that I should take up in order to feel more than myself? What is the practice like? Is it a gratitude diary, or is it something more observational, or is it about taking care of what's nearest and dearest to me, or all these different kind of practices which are in 100,000 self-help books now. And I think so that agnosticism has itself become a kind of confusion. I mean, there's actually a very tangible manifestation of this, which is called the replication crisis in psychology, and it's in other sciences as well, where findings that should be replicated, because that is the gold standards of science, it turns out that the vast majority of findings in psychology aren't readily replicated. And it's not much talked about, but it's almost a guilty secret of the subject. And I think part of what that's about is floating in a kind of ill-defined world that is unmoored, is ungrounded. It's just stuff happening, rather than stuff happening with an overriding purpose or direction, or qualities like what's good, beautiful, and true that help you to discern a way through all the events and experiences of life. And so again, spiritual intelligence, I think, can offer some illumination there by focusing on things like purpose, focusing on things like ground, saying no. There's clearly lots of suffering in the world, but it's underpinned by, say, kindness or compassion, like you say, not just because kindness and compassion are a good idea, but because kindness and compassion are an expression of the very ground of the cosmos. That's what its qualities are too. And so aligning with kindness and compassion is not just practically useful, but is revealing of the truth of things. So yeah, spiritual intelligence for me, this word intelligence can function in that way. It is a kind of wisdom, if you like, a kind of practical know-how, but it's also an idea about the way the world actually is. And so within Christianity, this would be fleshed out as Christian belief.
Yeah, beautiful. I think it might be really advantageous if you could put your website actually into the chat box,
Oh,
Mark.
okay.
And then people can, it's a fantastic resource. I really recommend that you go visit Mark's website, and on there, yeah, there's the book, there's all your bits on William Blake, your other writings. Yeah, it's great. And also it's worth saying that you have some fantastic conversations with Rupert Sheldrake on YouTube. Are they on YouTube?
Yeah, so the podcast and YouTube. No, Rupert and I have dialogues, but I post up other stuff as well for sure. Yeah, I really like the podcast dialogue form because I think this sense of emergence can come out of it.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it? We often reflect on this format actually, and how Zoom is so good at being intimate as well as, it crosses the boundaries, doesn't it, somehow? And it's such a gift for all of us to be where we are, but to be together. So this, yeah, it's great. I wonder, does anyone have any questions at all? Is there anything in the chat box? Is there anything else you'd like to say, Mark? Is there anything that you feel, yeah, is pressing as part of this
I mean,
conversation?
do befriend a guide like a William Blake or like a Dante or like a Mother Julian or um, I mean, I particularly was glad to get to know William Blake better because I live in South London and he walked the streets that I walked and saw the river that I see and moreover wrote in English, which is good because you can read it as a first language, not to learn Middle German or something. I would say live with a guide too. Possibly, if they're one of the spiritual greats, they'll probably be from another era. But that sense of connection and difference, I think, can too be a very fertile place to be because it makes you make your own what they're saying. So it lives again in you. So alongside your practice, meditation and so on, whatever it might be, do a bit of studying too. I think that is. I feel like we've got to a bit of a point where that's becoming more and more recognised. Actually, there has been a huge stress on experience and developing experience and seeking healing and the personal work, it might be said, or the shadow work, it might be said. And all these are good things. Don't get me wrong, but I feel like we're in a moment too where a bit of study, which always was part of the package, if you'd lived a religious life in the medieval world or before. So pick someone who speaks to you and befriend them. Because I do a lot with an organization called the Temenos Academy, and it's founded by Kathleen Raine, the poet. And her big insight really was that there are these inspired texts which you can learn about, but they will speak to you as well if you befriend them. And we're used to that with, say, the Bible, the kind of canonical texts. But there's all sorts of other texts that can do that as well. And my latest book's on William Blake for that reason, but I also wrote about the Divine Comedy, Dante's Divine Comedy, for that reason too.
Oh. So it's great advice because I've been reading and listening to Steiner now for about the last, I don't know, 10, 20 years. And I'm all I it's like I have to be ready to hear what he's got to say. And so I can listen to the same thing. I often have my headphones on and I'm in the garden and, I'm kind of in activity when I'm listening to him, but I will hear I can hear listen to the same thing and hear something different. It's like, oh, wow, I didn't realize he was saying that. Or, it's like it comes to a fruition. It's like, oh, I get it. I get it. And I've listened to that probably about 100 times, but I've heard it in a different way. So I really connect with what you're saying. There's something about, I think that's the changes in me, isn't it? So there's something about where I'm at when I'm listening to that, boom, then it kind of lands and it goes in and okay, now I understand. Yeah. And then I start making connections. It's kind of like a web, and they join up with the other things that I'm starting to understand. And quite often there's commonalities that arrive when you have a thought, then everything you see is related to it. You pick up the paper and there's a word that has there's a synchronicity or something, isn't there? So, yeah, I think there's a lot of wisdom out there to be recaptured, isn't there?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's one of the good things in our time actually is that um, a lot of this wisdom is you have to be a bit discerning, but it's very accessible too because of things like the internet. Um, and I think that's all part of the spiritual dynamics of our time. Actually, is that a quite eclectic bunch of guides are out there, and whilst that can be confusing, it is also, if you take an active stance towards it and say, no, 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 I'm good. I'm really going to go for what speaks to me, and use my best discerning capacities. And even if, like you're saying with Steiner, it doesn't make sense immediately, you sort of sense that there's something in it. And it's not trying to bamboozle you, it's not trying to manipulate you, it's not trying to sort of woo you in some way, or there's none of that kind of manipulative element going on. It's just offering, it's just there. And yeah, that too can be part of a spiritual practice these days.
Yeah, and what I like about that particular format is that it allows to me to be alone. So I don't need to be in a group, or I don't need to belong or be a particular. I don't, it doesn't need a label because it's just something I'm off doing on my own, and I find
Mm-hmm.
that that's really liberating because I'm kind of choosing my teachings. I'm choosing my teachers and I'm choosing my teachings. I don't feel like yeah, it's a different relationship than I've experienced before when I'm kind of searching, because often it starts with a group and then there's and so it allows that to, it gives me permission just to be on my own with my headphones with the one teacher, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. Um, so I think great advice. Thank you, Mark. It's really yeah, and all that you're doing, I think is really important for now. And I really encourage people to hook in to all the things that you do. And I really enjoy your YouTube little bursts that you do. That's really, it's almost like thought for the day, or, they, yeah, really, yeah, lovely offerings, really, really lovely offerings. Have you got anything coming up that we might come and see, or any talks that you might be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I do put them on my website. Actually, Rupert and I are doing our 100th dialogue this coming Sunday, if you're listening before the 15th of February. And we thought we'd do that live. And
And
so
is
that's
that
gonna
a
be,
podcast format like this, or is it
yeah,
a
so it's going to be live in Hampstead Parish Church.
wow?
But then we'll be either you can come in person or we'll be live streamed as well. Um, yeah, so you can find details about that from our website. Um, and yeah, but it's sort of rolling. I love talking about William Blake, and since my book came out, it feels like what Blake's got to say to us now keeps developing.
Mm.
So that's been quite a regular theme. And then Blake's anniversary actually is coming up in 2027. It's going to be the 200th anniversary of his death next year. And the Blake Society and others of us are going to try and make that as big a cultural moment as we can. Who knows whether it will capture the imagination at all, but nonetheless, we're just beginning to start to try and make noise about that. Yeah, so watch out for Blake 200.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I think there's a wave, a tide forming on that. And not only is it his words, but it's also his imagery, isn't it? So he crosses the boundary of the both, and he has so much to offer in the sense of not only his skill as, draftsman and his beautiful illustrations, but yeah, he's something that's, yeah, I mean, you're helping to regenerate and the lost words. And I think, I think it will be a fantastic celebration. And thank you for that because it's needed, particularly in our culture, particularly in British culture, I think.
Well,
Yeah.
it's funny when you mentioned Steiner. A big influence on me is Owen Barfield, who was one of the inklings with Lewis and Tolkien, and um, made his own spiritual discoveries, but then saw that Rudolf Steiner was onto them as well. And actually, both Rudolf Steiner and Owen Barfield were very into William Blake as well, as it happens. Um, but uh, I've slightly lost my thread of thought now, actually. But there was something about Barfield and what you were saying that I thought might be useful to add, but it's completely slipped my mind.
Oh,
Maybe it'll come back shortly. I can't remember now. Anyway,
well, it's absolutely fine because it's 7 o'clock.
very good.
And yeah, thank you so much for your giving your time today and your wisdom. And I hope that those that listen will get in touch and come and visit your website because I think it's a fantastic resource. And yeah, Mark, thank you very much for your time today. It's been enlightening.
Yeah, well, look, thank you for coming along, for listening, and the platform that you are nurturing as well, which of course is all part of this inquiry and um, renaissance even. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, well, it's been really enjoyable, and thank you everyone for joining
You.
us. Usual
Good
faces,
evening.
lovely to see Melanie and Ginny and Victoria. Thank you so much. Okay, go in
Bye
peace,
for now.
everyone. Good night.
Cheers.
Bye.